Hey everybody, welcome to episode 50 of the Go Get Outside podcast. This is your host, Jason Milligan. Welcome back, welcome aboard. That's right, I said episode 50. We have reached half a century. If this is your first time listening to the show and you enjoy it, well, good news, there are 49 more episodes like this one you can go back and listen to. And if this is your first time listening to the show and you hate this show, good news also, no one will force you to listen to the other 49 episodes. On today's show, we have UK explorer and best-selling author Tristan Gooley, also known as the Natural Navigator. He recently released a new book called How to Read Water that looks into all of the different signs and information we can gather from bodies of water of all sizes, be they puddles or oceans, and apply that to our everyday life. Because we are physically separated by a large distance, Tristan and I spoke one morning a couple of months ago by Skype and discussed how he became the Natural Navigator and how learning to read your environment and how to navigate your surroundings can benefit all of our lives. So let's go talk with Tristan Gooley.
My name is Tristan Gooley, aka the Natural Navigator. From a very young age, I love shaping journeys, and I found out that beautiful skill and art was called navigation, and then I found out it was even richer and more fascinating using nature instead of instruments. So that became my life, and that's what I did.
Yes, so I was looking at your books and also your bio. It says a number of things which I think are probably uncommon to the average people. I'll read over the list and try not to embarrass you as I do so, but this is what your own bio says. So this is your own fault, or your publicist or someone's own fault. So it says that you have been on expeditions on 5 continents. You've climbed mountains in Europe, Africa, and Asia. You've lived with native tribes in Borneo, which I imagine is particularly uncommon for most people. You've sailed small boats across oceans, piloted small aircraft to Africa and the Arctic, and you're the only living person, which leads me to believe that there may be some dead people who have also done this, to have flown solo and single-handedly across the Atlantic. And then on top of that, you are also a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation, the Royal Geographic Society, and the vice chairman of Trailfinders, and the author of 5 books?
Yes.
Yeah, and 3 of them are bestsellers, and there's a new one, How to Read Water, that has recently been released. So how does a person go about acquiring all these life experiences? Because I imagine most people listening to this have done none of these things or very few of these things.
Well, I think whenever anybody does something that warrants an interview like this, there's a temptation from all directions to think that there was some strategy or plan, that there was to use the navigational sort of ideas, that there was a clear A to B, but there wasn't in my case, and speaking to a lot of people who've had similar but maybe different journeys, there very rarely is. It's a case of doing things that you find challenging and interesting, and to do that effectively you might set yourself a short-term goal, and if you keep sort of doing that, there comes a point where you sort of pause and you put your hands on your knees and take a few deep breaths and you look back at where you've come from, and it's sort of roughly in a direction, but that wasn't necessarily the plan at the start of it. And that was very much my experience. I was, as I say, as a kid, I was quite restless. I'd see a hill and think it might be more interesting at the top than the bottom, and I was quite rebellious as well. I always found that if I was told very strictly, where I was going and how I was going to get there, it didn't actually matter what was at the destination. I didn't find it thrilling. So for me, finding my own way to something which was perhaps slightly mundane was always more exciting than being corralled towards some extraordinary site. And navigation, I learnt, probably before I knew what the word meant, navigation was the key to being able to shape my own journeys. And something I learnt in spirit, again, before this expression sort of became one I used, is that in all journeys we're either navigators or passengers, and there's nothing wrong with being a passenger, but it's quite fun to have the option to be a navigator. And unless you've sort of dabbled with navigation, which in truth we all do, that option isn't open to you. And the more we play with navigation, the more times we can say, yeah, I'm going to choose that option. I'm going to do it my way.
Yeah, one of the things that you said that I particularly identify with is where you say that you didn't particularly have a strategy or a plan. And I do think as humans, we tend to assume that everyone else has some sort of life plan except us, and that maybe they can help us figure out our life plan. Because I also often get the question of, oh, what have you got going on next? Or what made you do this? And it's, I don't know, I just wanted to do it and then it happened. Or I met someone who allowed it to happen, and there never was this necessary pathway to get me there.
Yeah. And I find it fascinating on lots of levels now. I find it fascinating for all ages. And I've got kids of my own now, 2 boys, 13 and 10. I'm starting to see that, they're just beginning to see the odd sort of fork in the road and deciding which way they go, and I'm sort of encouraging them not to sort of think that it has to lead somewhere amazing, but to sort of enjoy the choice, even if it's even if later you look back and go, well, I might choose the other path if I had my time again. At least you've made a choice and you've gone for it.
It is interesting though that you said you did not have a particular path or strategy, since you are known as a navigator. You go by the moniker, the Natural Navigator, and something I noticed as a recurring themes in your books is that they are very much about observing the world around you and then using that data to navigate through the world and be able to read the world. So what brought you to that? How did you go from a person who just exists in the world to a person that starts observing the world and then using that information to your benefit?
Well, there was the journeys over the years became a little bit more ambitious, a bit more adventurous, a little bit bolder, a little bit crazier at times. But to take on a bigger journey, it became a much more technical challenge. To fly a light aircraft anywhere these days, you're confronted. I mean, everybody knows what a cockpit looks like. You're effectively a systems manager. Everybody knows what it's like to sit in front of a computer these days, and sitting in a cockpit is like sitting in front of about sort of 35 of the things. And, I remember being a 10-year-old and climbing in a small boat and just trying to get round to the neighbouring beach or running up a hill and stuff. And the irony was, as sort of a 28-year-old or 30-year-old, I was taking on journeys where, in terms of the line on the map, it was bigger and more exciting on one level, but then the experience wasn't as exciting as mucking about in small boats as a kid. And it really, I wouldn't say it angered me, that's too strong, but it frustrated me, certainly. I had to sort of work out why, because this passion was ebbing away. It almost felt like I was losing something cherished. And just a happy coincidence, somewhere in my mid-20s, I came across the idea we can find our way using nature, and I decided to get amongst it. And I found that a 1-mile walk in the woods, using the trees, the wildflowers, the animals, or the stars as my map and compass, suddenly it was like somebody had given me that extraordinary feeling back. It was like being a 10-year-old, but with so many more options. So that's how my philosophy changed. I suddenly realised that I think everybody is familiar with the idea that we can use the sun and the stars to get some idea of direction. But the most exciting thing for me has been this part practical, but then the practical became philosophical. This approach means that literally everything we see, everything we sense, is part of a map and can be used as a map and compass. And I mean that literally. If you want to, for a bit of fun, you can name anything you can see outdoors. And I might not be able to give you a, knock you off your chair example, but I can certainly explain how I would try and fit that into my approach and use it as part of the map around me.
What are some of the base tenets of natural navigation versus other types of navigation?
There are sort of 2 broad levels. One is direction finding, and there are lots and lots of different ways we can find direction. The sun is due south in the middle of the day for everyone who's north of the tropics. So using the sun is quite a nice start. But then I think of the sun and the wind as leaving footprints. There's pretty much nothing outdoors that's symmetrical. Once you know what the influences have been up to over the previous hours, months, years, you can read back So very simply, if you've got a prevailing wind coming from the west and you notice all the tops of the trees are brushed over one way, it's quite quick to find west. That's one level. So everything can be used within that broad approach. And over the past 5 years, I think the most exciting thing for me has been taking an entirely different approach, which is a more ecological one. It's a similar deductive approach, but instead of it being pure direction finding, it's more about habitat. So every plant, every animal, every living organism has its place within the competitive outdoors environment. So every time we see a plant or an animal in a wild or semi-wild situation, or basically wherever it hasn't been put there by a human being, it's sending a message to us. It's saying, X thousand plants or animals tried to make this home. They failed. I didn't. So if you take a bit of time to get to know me, you'll work out why I didn't fail. So very simply, stinging nettles need phosphate-rich soil. Human beings make the soil richer in phosphate. Put the two together, stinging nettles are part of a map. They're telling us that we're either in or getting near civilization. So you can walk for 10 hours in a wild environment, not see a stinging nettle, but the second you approach even a minor bit of civilization, you'll start seeing stinging nettles.
I'm sure at some point you come across people who say, yeah, this is all really interesting, but I live in the age now where I have a phone with a GPS and it can just do everything for me, and I don't have to remember all these things that you're talking about. I can just check Google Maps or something. What would you tell those people? Why is it valuable to gain this kind of knowledge and learn to navigate this way?
Well, it's hugely valuable, but it involves getting past the idea that value is attached to necessity. A lot of the most interesting and life-enriching areas have nothing to do with necessity. We should all get through our lives without listening to any music, without seeing a film, without going to an art gallery. All of those things, the list could go on indefinitely, are totally unnecessary. They do not form a part of our essential survival kit. We could sit in a dark room with somebody feeding us with a spoon for a week, and we'd survive that, but it'd be pretty boring. So the question is, do we need it to survive? No, but is natural navigation a necessary part of the most interesting journeys? I believe so, because it forces us to stop and look, and that almost by definition gives us a richer experience, because we start seeing things, we start thinking, we start making connections. The truth is, people who have even a passing interest in natural navigation, I strongly believe, experience twice as much on their journeys. It's almost like you're being given an extra layer of experience.
Yeah, I do like that, because I agree with you that sometimes people try to argue from necessity, but then if we all look at our lives are populated with things that enrich our lives that aren't necessary. I really like that point about the fact that learning to observe nature more so can actually make the journey itself more enjoyable. And I think that in and of itself is of good enough value in addition to everything else that it could add to that. Would you like to give a few examples of ways that people could start to incorporate some of the lessons, or ways that people who perhaps aren't far removed from an urban environment would be able to use natural navigation in their own neighborhoods or in their own areas?
Yeah, I'll give you some contrasting examples. If we look at an urban environment, we can treat human beings as just a rather elaborately dressed animal. And the rule of thumb with animals is you don't attach too much weight to an individual. An individual bird might be having a bad day. It might be behaving in quite an erratic way, just as human beings can. A flock of birds heading one direction, maybe telling you something, but equally a group of people heading one direction can be telling you something. So a nice simple urban example is, if you're completely and totally lost in a new city and all you want is some anchor, something that you can say, okay, I've got some handle on roughly where I am now. If you go against the flow of people in the morning and with the flow of people late in the afternoon, you'll very quickly arrive at a station or other transport hub, and then you've found the kind of the start off point in that neighborhood, and that approach can apply to all sorts of animals. Totally different concept. If you're walking and you suddenly come across some fresh water you weren't expecting, it only needs to be a small pond, can be a giant lake, can be a river. If it caught you by surprise, if you just rewind and just walk the last 5 minutes again and just watch how the plants and if you're lucky, the animals will noticeably change. And the great thing is, you don't have to know the names of anything. I was put off embracing nature as a youngster because I thought, well, I'm being told to memorize so much stuff. If I get into nature, I'm going to have just another list of 2,000 things I have to learn, and there's going to be Latin in amongst it. What I say to people is names are voluntary. You know, there may come a point where they help you take shortcuts in terms of learning, but to start with, we don't need the names of anything. We can just look at a plant and go, oh, it's got some beautiful purple flowers and it's by the water, and then our brain has evolved to take shortcuts in this area, to spot patterns and to make these associations without us sort of having to treat it like an exam. Just this morning, I was walking around in Brooklyn, and I walked to the water, and there's a willow tree there, and that's no coincidence. Willow trees grow by water, and quite often you make that association. Quite often you see the willow tree and you think, I didn't know there's some water there, and then you have another look around and you find the water. So that's the very simplest start of map making using plants. And then just one more, finding direction. The shape of tree branches is quite a fun one. Not all, but most green plants are growing towards the light. And on the south side of trees, we find the branches are closer to horizontal. On the north side of trees, they're a little bit closer to vertical. Creates an effect I call the check effect. When you look at a tree from the side, which in this case is from west or east, you'll see that shape, the slightly more vertical branches on the north side and more horizontal on the south side, creating, if you squint a little bit, it looks a little bit like a check.
So at some point you decided that you were gaining all this knowledge about different ways to observe nature and navigate through nature, and you decided that you should write not one but several books dealing with that sort of topic. So what made you decide to share that information?
Again, there was no plan to write. There was a long-term plan. I was sort of thinking, well, I'll keep collecting these things for my own amusement. It's that sort of mad professor type idea, I guess, that you hope to write the definitive tome and be happy with it yourself, even if it sits in the corner of a room and nobody else gets any joy from it. I was thinking, if that's the way this is going to go, I'm very happy with that idea. And in the end, there was a strong interest for me to write it sooner than I was planning to, which was actually a blessing in disguise in lots of different ways, because I was falling into the trap of thinking you don't write something down until you know everything, and anything to do with nature, you quickly realise you're never ever going to know everything. You're never going to know 1% of everything, so you have to kind of celebrate that idea rather than feel defeated by it. So I wrote the Natural Navigator, and I had no thought of writing anything else, but it was, I'm very grateful it proved popular and did well. Ever since then, I've been trying to take the same idea that everything outdoors is a sign, it's a clue, it's giving us an insight, it has meaning, and approaching that from similar but different angles. So each book really is, I write it with a slightly selfish motive. I'm sort of thinking, what would I have liked to have read 5 or 10 years ago that would be a real shift in perspective, that would genuinely make my time outdoors feel different and more worthwhile and more exciting. And that's kind of the creed for my books, is I try not to write a whole page without putting something in there that I would have, and hopefully my readers do think, yeah, that is interesting.
So your newest book is How to Read Water. So what made you decide to break water specifically out of everything else in nature and focus on that for an entire book?
Well, it was born of an excitement that became a frustration, which returned to excitement. And what happened was, I think when any of us find a passion, it doesn't matter if we're young, old, or in between, we look for heroes. We look for, to use a couple of navigational expressions, we look for leading lights, we look for beacons, and so inevitably I found Captain James Cook, and by the time I was in my mid-20s I'd probably read a dozen biographies of him, and something that leapt off the pages was that Cook was, and I quote, perfectly lost in admiration for the Pacific Island navigators, because in his day, Cook had the very latest navigation technology. He was testing some of it. It was space program stuff in his day. He found these navigators in the Pacific were able to cross large parts of the ocean with no instruments at all. He realised that they were seeing their surroundings at a level that even he, one of the greatest navigators of all time, was bowled over by. So I thought, that's fantastic. Are these signs in the water? And actually there are some wonderful expressions all around the world, different cultures, the Vikings, the Arab navigators, all around the world. You find that this lore, L-O-R-E lore, this collection of wisdom has different names. And historically, navigators were seen in a different way to today. They were on a sort of level with priests. So you tended to have a chief or a king, and then you go down to the next sort of caste or level, and you'll have priest navigators and a few others, because it was life or death, and because it took a huge amount of experience to gain this knowledge. So I was very excited by this idea that there are these signs in the water, and all of humanity and in its many different sort of cultures has recognised these signs and sort of collected them and passed them on in their own way. So that was the excitement. The frustration came because I was struggling to see how I could bring that into my daily life. You know, the way I approach my work is, again, it's quite selfish sometimes. I'm like, you know, I might notice over the course of a year, I might come across, if I'm lucky, 1,000 things, signs outdoors, of which, you know, if I'm very lucky, 100, you know, stay with me in my outdoors experience, and maybe 2 years later, there might only be something like 30 or 40 of them left, and those tend to be the ones that make it into the book. But what I was finding is with these water signs, there was no shortage of them. There was, you know, I've collected over 1,000 over the years, but I was struggling to bring them into daily life. So they were kind of sitting in a slightly academic, you know, distance from me. But then that all changed in a very surreal way. I was on not even a proper walk, just a stroll in the English countryside. And I saw a pond, and I saw the Pacific Ocean in an English pond, which is a sort of crazy thing to say, so I'll kind of explain it. The patterns I saw in the water in the pond were identical. Not a little bit like, but identical to the same patterns that the Pacific Island navigators used to find islands. Because what was happening is the wind were blowing ripples past an island, in inverted commas, in this pond. The island was just a clump of water lilies. But the patterns that formed around the water lilies I recognised instantly from the many times that I'd seen the way that the navigators, of course they don't approach it with these sort of scientific sort of terms, but basically waves are bending through a process we know as refraction and another one called diffraction, and they meet again and they overlap, and you get places where the waves don't reach, called a swell shadow. And that was the breakthrough for me, because I suddenly realised, okay, so it's not a case that this is an ocean technique that works only in the Pacific or only in massive sort of blue water environments. This is applicable down to a patch of water that was only a few yards across. And then actually I realised you can even see it in a bathtub. And that was the most exciting moment, because all of this stuff that kind of sat frustratingly out of reach in terms of daily experience, I suddenly started seeing in the space of a couple of months, hundreds of these things I was seeing. I mean, they were right in front of my eyes for years and years. And that's quite often the case with the things I work with. You know, I pleasantly shock myself, and that's a good sign. That's a sign it's something I'm onto something. And with water, that's very much what happened. I suddenly realised that hundreds of things that my brain had perhaps compartmentalised as being, you know, geographically only valid in a good example would be, kayakers will be familiar with the concept of something called a hole or a stopper. And, you know, when water flows over a large rock, it plunges down and punches a hole in the water. And then the water downstream flows back up to fill it, creating a standing wave, water that's effectively trying to flow the wrong way, in inverted commas. Now, on a grand scale, it's very well known, because sadly it kills people every year. But during this sort of revelation of you know, this scale breakthrough, I started seeing these holes, these stoppers, another name is hydraulics. I started seeing them on a scale the size of my thumb in tiny little streams, and I realised they're everywhere. So I could go on, but you get the idea. I collected all of these things, and I was slightly worried they were going to sit out there, and suddenly I found them that they were under my nose everywhere.
Yeah, that is interesting how something as large as the ocean could be represented in something as small as a puddle, and how all of those dynamics scale.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see these things right down to you know, the size of your hand, and equally you can scale up. So yeah, the bath is quite a nice scale. If you ask somebody, what colour is the sea? Well, I'll do it to you now just for fun. You know, what colour is the sea?
Well, it's the colour of reflected light, so it's often the colour of the sky. Yeah,
it's a fair answer. If we look at a shallow angle at water, you're absolutely right. We will see the reflected. If we look down, however, we look through water. So if you stare down, if you're on a boat out at sea and you stare vertically down into the water, most of what you see won't be reflections, but still it can look, you know, blue. It might have a bit of green. It might have a bit of grey in it, that sort of stuff. And yeah, if you dip a cup into the water and pull it up to your eyes, all those colours disappear. it becomes transparent again, like some strange magic trick. And we can explore that. If you run a bath, ideally a white bath, and you run some water, if there's only half an inch of water in the bottom, you look through, it's transparent. You keep the water running, when it's near the top of the bath, you see a very light blue tint. That's the beginning of understanding the colours we see out there, because water absorbs light, but it absorbs the reds, oranges and yellows much more effectively than the blues and the greens. And there's one particular wavelength of bluey green colour which gets through most effectively.
Right. So for instance, when you go diving and you get down to 60 feet or so, and then all you can see are blues because everything else has been absorbed, correct?
Exactly, yeah. It's the colour before darkness, yeah.
Now, you have collected all of this information over your lifetime in your own personal experience and then also on these varieties of expeditions that you've gone on. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the types of expeditions that you've done across the world?
Yeah, I again, the approach is a tiny bit unusual because I'm lucky. I rub shoulders with lots of fascinating people in my line of work, and one of the groups are professional adventurers. I mean, there aren't a lot of people in the world who sort of put professional adventure on their business cards, but there are, not thousands of them probably, but hundreds. The interesting thing is they approach journeys with, there's a sort of excitement scale, and there has to be a narrative as well. I've been in this situation, and I've sat with adventurers when they're going like, well, why don't we try and be, and quite often these words come, the first or the fastest, or, so that's the narrative part. And then there's got to be a sort of geographic part to say, why don't we become the first? And unfortunately, because so much has been done, sometimes it does become mildly ridiculous. We could be the first people to run backwards up this glacier. And I don't have anything negative to say about that, because it's tough. It's tough for anyone making a living in outdoors expertise of any kind. So, it's good luck to everyone from my perspective. But I'm approaching things differently. I'm not looking for adventure. I mean, as a young man, I enjoyed it as much as the next. Now, and certainly for the last 15, maybe even 20 years, it's been about collecting information and knowledge and research. So if the stuff I want can be found, in a book, I'll go there first. And if it can be found by walking in my local woods in Sussex in England, that's where I'll go. And if I have to spend 4 nights sitting on a cold hill somewhere, that's what I'll do. But some knowledge sits more distantly than that, more sort of at a further remove. So I wanted to understand how you find your way in arguably the hardest environment, which is the tropical rainforest, the jungle. And so I headed into the heart of Borneo and walked across a section of the heart of Borneo. It was only about 40 miles as the crow flies, but in dense jungle, that's enough. I'll just say that's enough. There were 4 of us. There was myself, a fixer interpreter, and 2 Penan Dayak tribespeople. And I was really just trying to work out how they were doing it. The answer's quite a long one. It's written up in some detail in my book, The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs. But the short answer is they have a sort of forensic understanding and ability to read gradient and the behaviour of water and that relationship with valleys. So their whole perspective, they're not interested in north, south, east, west. They're interested in uphill, downhill, or upriver or downriver. And just those concepts are enough to make sense of what's going on around them.
Yeah, how long did you live there with the tribes in Borneo?
It was quite brief. And most of my trips, again, I'm not doing it as an anthropologist. I'm not trying to understand how do they sort of plant their crops and harvest them and that sort of stuff. I'm going in there and trying to get the knowledge. So I was with them for, I think it was 30 days, start to finish. There's 2 or 3 days where there's an element of distrust always, because anybody goes in asking the sort of questions I ask, must have some ulterior motive, because who would want to know that stuff? Quite often there's a bit of a language barrier as well. And then at some point, it can take 2 days, occasionally it takes a couple of weeks. The trust is established and the knowledge flows. And one trick I've learned actually is to teach a little bit. I have to be very careful, obviously, not to teach grandma to suck eggs, not to be patronising, not to anything like that. And more often than not, these people know far more than I do about the sort of stuff I want to know, obviously. So I'll teach something that's related but different. So, for example, in in both the Libyan Sahara with the Tuareg or in Borneo with the Dayak, I was able to show them stuff to do with the stars that they didn't know. But again, it had to be by invitation. If I walked in there and go, come on everybody, it's lesson sort of 1A, we're gonna do the stars today. Obviously it backfire. These are practical outdoors people by necessity rather than choice, which is the case for many of us. There normally comes a point where they appreciate, some of this stuff could actually add a tiny bit of value to their experience. And so that's, when that happens, I know that the exchange is going to go up a whole level and the information starts flowing quite fast. And then it tends to tail off because there's not a million examples. It tends to be somewhere between, 4 and a couple of dozen, what I think of as kind of breakthrough examples that they're able to show me. And then after that, I'm generally on my way because it's uncomfortable.
30 days is not an insubstantial amount of time. So I imagine it's enough time to, if not become part of their unit, like I know you said it takes some time to build trust and things, but it's at least enough time for you to gather enough information about how different a life experience it is there versus your own personal life experience. So what are some of those things that you noticed that were just drastically socially different about the tribes you stayed with there versus what you were used to the way you grew up?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think I can speak with total authority because for that reason I haven't immersed for long periods. But there are a couple of very small things which I actually think the American biologist and naturalist E.O. Wilson, there's a wonderful line attributed to him, which is the obvious is usually profoundly significant. And I think that's the case sometimes when you meet people, not just in the middle of nowhere, but socially as well. So, but anyway, something I noticed about the Dayak is they are practical to the point of it being a life philosophy, by which I mean they don't seem to sort of sit around the way we do, talking about things that have some bearing on our existential crises, and they find a practical way to fill almost every minute. It was hard physical walking, and that's another way to earn trust. If you walk up and down mountains for 4 days with sweat dripping off your chin and you stay relatively quiet for the first 2 or 3 days if possible, there's a bond that gets formed through that, and that I think is a universal thing. A little bit of hardship brings people together or drives them very fast apart, but normally together. And something I noticed with the Dayak is, and to a slightly lesser extent with the Tuareg, is their hands are always busy. Any Western people I've ever travelled with, you sit down and you might make a cup of tea or have a cup of water or whatever it is, but that's it. You then go into this sort of still chatty mode, whereas the Dayak, there's less chatting and there's a lot more looking around and using their knives and their machetes, shaping sticks. Even if they don't have an immediate need for something, they will find something practical they have to do. And I found that fascinating because I'm starting to wonder actually if it's something innate that would relax all of us. We get accused of fidgeting if we do things with our hands that don't have an immediate and urgent need, but I wonder whether actually it might make us all a bit more relaxed. It's I don't know. I might go and do a bit of research on it.
So I know we're starting to run short on time. What do you have ahead in the future? What things are you looking forward to next? Or have you planned out any next expeditions or next steps and things that you want to do from here? I'm working. I'm doing a lot of research at the moment into, psychologists broadly agree that we have two types of thinking. We have our conscious thought. If you have to work out anything, analyze anything, solve many problems, you'll think about it and the cogs whir. But then there's an instant type of thinking, well, not instant, but very, very sort of rapid assessment. And I'm doing some work at the moment to try and see whether it's possible for us to move slightly closer to what I'm convinced was our ancestors' way of viewing the outdoors, which was much more intuition. So my books are full of these examples. You go out and you can learn how to tell the time using the stars. So you use the Big Dipper to find the North Star, you use the angle from the North Star, you do a few calculations in your head and it'll tell you the time, which is really good fun stuff. That obviously is quite a slow calculation. What I've noticed in my experience is that there are certain constellations that I don't use to find direction, they are direction, which the challenge for me in my current work is to sort of explain that better. But I think, if somebody walks out, you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about the difference between day or night. And the truth is, everybody gets to know their environment. Even for example, within an office, you get to know
who's in a good mood, who's in a bad mood, long before they've opened their mouths, because that part of your brain is used to doing that sort of thing. That can be applied to the outdoors, and that's where I'm doing quite a lot of work at the moment.
So where are some of the places people could go online to find your work? Any particular websites or social media links you want to share?
Yeah, thanks. I have quite an extensive website, www.naturalnavigator.com. And you can explore the subject via any of the sort of lines that interest you. So there's a whole load of collection of star examples or sun examples or plants or animals or the weather or the sea. What I've noticed in people is people tend to have a stronger interest in one area. They might be really into animals, and you can use animals to make a map and find your way. And through doing that, you start to notice some of the other examples, and so you branch out into the subject more broadly. But it's obviously a good idea to start with your sort of natural interest. And the website's structured so you look down the left hand side and there are all those topics, and you can have a look there, and there's a description of each of my books if you want to go deeper into it.
The thing I like to do here at the end of the show is give you an opportunity to leave the audience with any final thoughts you may have, or discuss a topic that we didn't get around to before we go.
Well, I'd love, thanks. Yeah, I'm very keen people give this a go. It's a particularly sort of unusual sort of outdoors interest, but I'd like everybody to have a go, and so I'd really like it if your listeners at some point over the next 24 hours ask yourself the question, which way am I looking, and use nature to answer the question. Doesn't matter if you're wrong or right. Then you can use a compass or a compass on a smartphone or something like that to see how well you did. Great fun if it's a place you don't know, like the back of your hand. But next time you're about to reach for your smartphone, you might be waiting for a train or waiting to meet a friend or something like that. Just look up just before you look at the phone. Just say, which way am I looking? And there'll be probably about 100 clues within sight that you can use to answer that question. And as I say, nothing lost if you get it wrong, because you'll probably have some fun anyway.
That's right. So we're going to leave everybody with a little bit of homework, with something to do after they listen to the show. So I know you need to get off to other things for the day. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and good luck with everything, and enjoy your time in New York while you're there.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, Jason. Thanks very much for having me on your show.
Something from that conversation that will stick with me is when Tristan said, "We are all passengers or navigators." And I think that simple thought says a lot more than it sounds like it says. So when I have authors on this show, I always tend to read their book before I've completed their episode, and this is no different. I have read How to Read Water, and I found it very accessible and enjoyable. I've also read a few survival books and other books that deal with some similar topics. And sometimes those can be very dry, and you have to sort of struggle through them. And one thing I've found to be very refreshing about How to Read Water is that it is not written in that way. It does not read like a survival book. It focuses on how reading science and nature are beneficial to you, but then it also kind of revels in the wonder of what it feels like to make these discoveries. It looks at nature very practically and sprinkles in just enough science to reinforce the points without losing the reader. Another aspect that I really like is how it starts with the micro, it starts with puddles, and then it builds to the larger bodies of water and rivers and oceans. But along the way, you learn how those things that exist in those larger bodies of water are just amplifications of the same fundamentals of nature that exist in a glass of tap water. And so he does a great job combining these macro and micro concepts and showing how the skills that you can develop by reading water of all sizes can be beneficial across all spectrums of life. I highly recommend it, and after reading it, I look forward to going back and reading some of his other books as well. And so that brings us to the part of the show where I beg you to visit our website, gogetoutside.com/podcast, episode 50, Tristan Gooley. There you will find our show notes with photographs of Tristan in action and a link to naturalnavigator.com, his website, where you can find plenty of valuable information about him, about navigating, and where you can acquire his various books. And while you are there on the internet, should you desire to contact us here at the show, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can email us, go@butcherbirdstudios.com, or you can send us a voicemail, 818-925-0106. And I ask that you do us a tiny little favor and go to your podcast purveyor of choice. Make sure you're subscribed to the show, rate the show, review the show, share it with somebody who might like it. Next time on the show, Cindy Lang. I am happy to announce that episode 51 will be about a topic we have never discussed at all here on the show. We are going to talk about horseback riding. So come back June 16th and find out what Cindy Lang has to tell you about horses. See you then.